Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Kieran O'Connor. I'm joined today by my colleague, friend, and co-host, Miss April Lawson. How you doing, April?
Great. How about you, Kieran?
I'm doing pretty well. It's springtime in New York City, and I'm just getting ready for the great American summer of 2021.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, we are joined today by one of our favorite people, Amanda Ripley. She's a friend of Braver Angels. She's also a New York Times bestselling author and investigative journalist. She's written for Time Magazine, The Atlantic, many other publications. Amanda has spent her career trying to make sense of complicated human stories. In her books and her magazine writing, she combines storytelling with data to illuminate hard problems and explore solutions. Her latest book, which we will get into today, is entitled High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. It's about how good people get captured by high conflict and how they might break free. And I'm also curious to hear what makes conflict high. As I mentioned, Amanda is both a friend of Braver Angels and a friend of me and April. We had the pleasure of having a coffee with her in January 2020, right before the pandemic, which seems like eons ago. And so it's great to have Amanda back and chart our own journey through conflict and how we might help Americans use conflict as a way to come together rather than just dominate and demonize each other. So Amanda, welcome to the Braver Angels podcast.
Thank you, Kieran. Good to see you both. So glad to be here.
Yes, it is good to be here. So before we jump into the latest book, which I think will be of immense interest to our listeners, I'd love to hear a little bit about your overall approach to telling stories.
You know, what I find is my pattern, and I'm only just realizing this for some reason, is that I end up reporting on a really, wicked problem for a number of years. And then I get to a point where I just can't continue the same way, like where I just get really exhausted by the formula or the back and forth. And first it was when I was covering terrorism and disasters, and then education, and then polarization, political polarization. So in each case, I end up doing a book as a sort of thinly veiled attempt to find hope and sanity for myself. And then the way I find personally most hope or most useful lessons is to follow people who have been through some kind of transformation, people who have been to the other side and can sort of speak to both experiences. Like they can see the water they swim in, right? Because it's so hard the closer you are to something to see it anymore. So trying to collect wisdom from regular people who have made a transformation of some kind, whether it's the survivors of disasters who, when I worked at Time Magazine, I was covering 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina and other disasters. And the survivors would tell me these really surprising, interesting, useful things about how their brain had behaved in a disaster, things they wished they had known. And none of those things would naturally end up in the story, bizarrely enough. So that was my first book. And then the next one was about education. And that was, I followed American teenagers for a year who went to high school, public high schools in countries with really rock star school systems to see, like, what does that actually look like through the eyes of a student? Because I can't do that. I'm too old. You know what I mean? Like I can't see what they see. And so again, like it's hugely helpful to sort of follow that journey. And now with High Conflict, this last book, it's following people who have been trapped by, pretty unpleasant conflicts, personal, political, all kinds of conflict, and gotten to a better place, and they're still fighting for their cause, but they're just much more effective in conflict and much less miserable. as humans, you know? So like trying to figure out, how do they do that? What do they know that they wish the rest of us knew?
So I'd love to hear more about the stories within that. But first, just what does high conflict mean?
Yeah, so it comes from the term high conflict divorces. Have you guys ever heard of that? It's basically a term of art that, you know, psychologists and divorce attorneys use. And basically about 20%, depending on the study, of American divorces can be categorized as high conflict. And, you know, what that means more or less is that the conflict has become so all consuming that it takes on a life of its own. It's like a perpetual motion machine. And everything you do to try to end the conflict makes it worse, usually. So the only people that typically benefit in a high conflict divorce are the lawyers. At least they benefit economically, right? So it turns out you can have high conflict politics, high conflict companies, high conflict neighbors. I mean, there's any number. I mean, the behavior in divorces versus neighborhood feuds versus labor strikes versus politics is surprisingly similar, because once conflict reaches a certain level, humans behave differently, right? And you know this, you've seen it. We miss things, we make mistakes, we miss opportunities. It feels different. We tend to collapse into an us versus them mentality. We start to generalize about sometimes many millions of people we will never meet. And so it is like lots of things going on there. Probably the most chilling part of every high conflict I've looked at is that eventually you start to mimic the behavior of your adversaries. So the thing that brought you into the fight, you sort of end up doing without realizing it. So that's the risk. And what the lesson for me was, you know, it's not about getting out of conflict. That's originally what I was looking for. It's about getting out of high conflict, because there is such a thing as good conflict. And I've now seen it enough up close that I'm convinced it exists, and you have seen it and you have helped cultivate it through Braver Angels. So it is a thing. It's not a fantasy. And it is a very different feeling. And it can be really stressful and awkward and unpleasant and heated. And it goes somewhere worth going. Like you're not sure how it's going to end. Whereas in high conflict, you feel like you know what the other person's going to say before they start talking. You know, I don't know if you feel like this, but for the past few years in the United States, I don't feel like I have to read any political stories. I had to read the headline and I know what it's going to say, you know. It's just not that interesting anymore, because you just say this, you're just going round and round. It's sort of like you remember those, I think they're called Chinese finger traps. You'd get at like arcade prizes. And yeah, you put your fingers in, and the more you pull, the tighter it gets. That's what high conflict's like.
So that's fascinating. And it brings to mind many questions, but I think first, just for just an illustration would be really helpful. I'm thinking of all sorts of different things, but you say it feels different. What does it feel like? And what is can you tell us a story that would help us know, like, is there a line that you cross? And I understand that you probably don't notice when you cross it, but like, what does it feel like? Tell us about that.
I think one of the defining characteristics of the feeling of high conflict is bafflement, just being totally mystified by the other side's behavior. Like it just makes no sense to you at all.
Really?
And then there's other kinds of conflict where you totally disagree, like deeply, but you're not as baffled, right? You're not like, what the what? You know, there's like a different, it's also the speed, like time turns out to be really important. So in all the conflicts I followed, slowing down the conflict turns out to be really important. So high conflict tends to move really quickly. And just to give you an example, in gang violence is right now, preventing gang violence is mostly about monitoring social media and trying to get disrespectful, inflammatory posts taken down before somebody gets shot, and not taken down by Facebook, taken down by the person who posted it from a rival gang. So this is an incredibly inefficient but necessary process, as you can imagine, because social media speeds up conflict. You can, there was always disrespect happening, but now you can broadcast it. You can make it very efficient. And slowing it down means trying to interrupt that feedback loop. With divorces or marital conflict, one of the things that seems to be very useful, and actually any conflict, is looping or active listening techniques where you really show the other person that you've heard them and you're trying to understand them, even as you totally disagree. And you notice if you've tried to do that, how it does slow down the sort of cascade of assumptions that we have about each other. And so that's what conflict mediators try to do. And it's not something we're taught typically, unfortunately. I went into this, I did like 80 hours of mediation training for this book, and I thought I knew how to interview people pretty well. I mean, I've been doing it for a long time, right? But I had mistaken nodding and smiling for listening, which, by the way, don't stop nodding and smiling. I very much appreciate it. But yes. I would furrow my brow and listen and write down what I'm interviewing people. And there is a difference between looking like you're listening and proving that you've listened. So proving means sometimes interrupting the person. Whenever they say something you can tell is really important to them, distilling it into the most elegant language you can muster, playing it back, and then asking, did I get that right? With genuine curiosity. And it's amazing the effect this has on people, right? It changes everything, even when you get it wrong, which is more often than I'm, keen to admit. But they will tell you what you got wrong. And everything, there's a lot of really interesting research on this. Everything people say once they feel heard, everything people say is less extreme, more interesting, more nuanced. They acknowledge more internal contradiction. They will be more open to information they don't want to hear. It is really the key to the kingdom in conflict and any heated or even a conversation. I mean, I use it now all the time. I use it in parenting. I use it every interview I do, even if it's with an academic about their research, because it's not emotional necessarily for me, but it can be for them. It's important to them. So proving that you've heard someone, and that process slows down the assumptions we make.
Yeah. I've been on sort of my own journey of experiencing the power of paraphrasing and acknowledging and reflecting back and essentially honoring the other party in a relationship. And I've tried to bring those skills to my personal relationships that I've learned in Braver Angels pretty effectively, although sometimes people feel like I'm armchair psychologizing them. And they're like, I see what you're doing here. I see what you're doing here. But it's incredibly powerful, because it's become so rare. So right away, people are like, oh, that's weird. They're actually trying to faithfully understand what I'm saying. It also makes people feel like you're not trying to intentionally misrepresent them, which is, I think, a dynamic we've all been so conditioned to perceive. And third, I think it allows people to express their identity in a way that's more unique to them. And so it sort of counters the flattening and tribalizing and stereotyping that we all do. And so it's interesting that you started from a place of marriage therapy and divorce counseling, because, as you know, that's essentially where Braver Angels got started too. And so it's just fascinating that it really starts at the deepest human level. But when you extrapolate it, you get the conflicts that you see in Syria and Rwanda and Colombia. And I know you talk about Colombia specifically in the book. So I'd be curious what you saw there, because I think in Colombia, you actually saw that thousands of people found a way to transcend the conflict in some way.
Yeah, it is so amazing how much psychology takes over and politics becomes less important. And yet the way we often talk about it is all politics and policy, right? And it's probably should have all three, but we almost never talk about the psychology. So that's one of the things I love about Braver Angels, is that you're not hiding from the reality that humans are actually human. That's baked into the whole process. And I remember feeling it I need to answer your question about Colombia, but I remember feeling it in myself. I went to my first Braver Angels workshop as a reporter probably 3 or 4 years ago in Virginia, just outside of DC where I live. And so I was sitting on the margins, literally, because I was there as a reporter. I was not participating. And I remember I tend to lean left. Like most people, I have on some things I'm more right and some things I'm more left. But anyway, I lean left on average. And I remember there were these two Reds, conservatives, in the room participating. And they were both just like really funny. Like they had a good sense of humor. And I remember feeling myself, before I even noticed what was happening, I could feel myself begin to really like them. And then sort of notice how much that changed the way I perceived everything else they said. And it's like this amazing way in which our lens onto the world is so shaped by, human connection or psychology. So anyway, that's just my own little Braver Angels story. I'm sure we could spend many hours on those. But I went to Colombia because, for better and for worse, Colombia has many decades of experience trying to get people to leave high conflict of the violent kind. Having had a civil war that lasted, more than half a century, it was incredibly destructive in every way. All sides committed atrocities. Colombia eventually created an agency within its government that is quite large and spends more money than any other government that I know of per non-combatant, per people who leave conflict, trying to reintegrate them into society. So a lot of what they've learned is through error and trial, right? It's not like they've solved the problem by a long shot. But more people have left conflict voluntarily in Colombia through their demobilization program than have left since the peace treaty was signed a few years ago with the FARC, which is the main guerrilla movement there. Anyway, so there are lots of things they learned, but just to give one example, we all carry multiple identities around in our lives, right? And one thing they learned is it's very hard to get people to give up an existing identity as in this case, rebel fighter for justice or a communist. It is much easier, and still hard, but much easier to get people to revive a latent identity or make a new one. So you can't ask people to give up that old identity entirely. You can, and some of the most creative, intriguing propaganda that the Colombian government has done, actively work to invite people home, to remind them that they had mothers, fathers, children who were waiting for them. They had a great campaign they did on the radio during national soccer games in Colombia, where they invited people to come watch the game at home because they knew that the FARC listened to those games religiously and on the radio. And, they tried other things that didn't work as well, but from some new research that hasn't come out yet, but is sort of previewed in the book by a researcher named Juan Pablo Aparicio, he found that he could study the number of demobilizations in Colombia. And because this is the other nice thing is Colombia keeps pretty good data compared to most places, tracking all the tens of thousands of people who have left the conflict. And he could see, what happened after one of these national soccer games, right, aired in Colombia. And what he found is that a soccer game with one of those public service announcements inviting members of the conflict to come home led to 20 extra guerrilla members demobilizing the day after a game, which was 10 times the daily average for desertions over many years. And demobilization stayed up in those areas a week after the game was played. And it was kind of cool, just to put a tie a bow around this story. He could figure it out. He had a natural experiment because when it rains in Colombia, the radio reception's really bad. So he could see where it rained using NASA data and then see where it didn't rain. So he could tell where the FARC members likely heard the ad and where they didn't, and compare the differences in sort of defections from county to county, essentially across the country. So in that case, they revived an identity as a soccer fan, as a Colombian, right? And as a family member. So family is a very common one that threads through a lot of these stories as a way to get people to realize they've had enough and try something else.
So that is totally fascinating. I I don't know how you're feeling, Kieran. I am wishing we had like another 4 hours to talk about this, because that's so interesting. And I feel like that's one of the best theories I've heard for how do you transform American politics with regard to polarization, which of course is a flaming example of high conflict in the sense that it has a life of its own. Like you could a lot of strategies are around trying to get people not to give up their identity, but to choose and to like emphasize a different one, right? And the sort of stereotypical one is like, oh, you're an American before you're a Democrat or whatever. That almost never works, though, it seems like. And so I'm interested in what you've learned about when that works and why, because it seems like there are lots of these strategies and they almost all fail. And so, and particularly with regard to groups that are in some way radicalized, right? Like there are moderates in America who say like, okay, yeah, there's some problems, but like, can we all just like, get behind civics? People are like, nah, not having it, right? And so when does that work and why? What have you learned?
Yeah, so you're right that there's different segments. I mean, there are people for whom it's easier to incite or invoke or revive an old or new identity. I think part of it is also timing. So it's targeting different people, but it's also timing. So one thing that the people who study intractable conflict have taught me is that high conflict is a system. So you have to wait for sort of shocks to the system. And then there's often an opportunity, to like, there's this moment, and it doesn't last for too long, where the system's a little bit destabilized. And those interlocking parts that just go on autopilot in high conflict are sort of like, plates spinning in the air. And so we saw this with January 6th, with the riot at the Capitol. I think for some people that probably was a saturation point or a moment of reckoning where they decide to do something different in the conflict. Obviously not for most, right? It has to be seized, like these saturation points, and that's not an easy thing. You need people who are just outside the conflict, who are not as engaged, to seize those moments to help people they love to realize they've lost too much. They're now harming the thing they hold most dear. So with gang violence, just to take another extreme example, only because sometimes it's easier to see the contours of something with extremes, the people who work to prevent gang violence will do things like go to the hospital if a gang member gets shot to visit him. And if no other gang members have visited, that's an opportunity. Something terrible's happened. Frame that as a saturation point, a point where the losses now outweigh the gains. And that's not the end of the story, right? That's the beginning. Like there's a lot of work that has to be done around reviving other identities, building new identities. But there's an opening, and seizing that opening is the role of leaders and family and friends. As for your question about sort of extremists, how do you reach them? I was just talking to somebody who does work with extremists around the world. And it seemed like, it was really interesting actually, because I used to write about de-radicalization after 9/11. And, there was a lot of like experimental attempts to de-radicalize members of Al-Qaeda, and some of it didn't work at all, and some of it was mixed. But it seems like the sort of leading edge thinking now about dealing with true believers who are violent is less about de-radicalizing them and more about re-radicalizing them, taking the passion that they have, the thing that really is driving them to go to Syria or whatever it is, and trying to get into that. Like, what is that? And then redirecting it towards something that's actually true and positive and useful in society. It's tricky, right? But people who are extremists, even violent extremists, not all, but some of them, what they want is radical change. They care deeply about something. They don't think of themselves as full of hate, even if they are, right? So that's not bad necessarily, those things I've just listed, right? Caring deeply, wanting dramatic change. Like, the world needs dramatic change. We can all agree. But it's being directed in a destructive manner in a lot of cases. So then it's about sort of raising up leaders or former leaders who have credibility and can legitimately make the case for redirecting or channeling that kind of passion.
That sort of makes me think about the voter fraud / voter suppression issue in the United States, because apart from, in my view, certain politicians or political groups that I think are sort of cynically using the issue just to gain raw power, I think there are, tens of millions of Americans who are radicalized on either side of the issue, but sort of ironically united in the fact that they think they're standing up for democracy. You know what I mean? And so it's sort of ironic if you can step back and make people realize that, and sort of like almost unite around your passion in opposition and reframe it. And we focused a lot on that issue recently because it seems to be such a crystallization of the existential stakes that people feel around partisan conflict in the United States, and touches upon our deepest values and our deepest notions of fairness. And so I think the US political polarization example is a tough nut to crack, although when you compare it to things like FARC in Colombia or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we haven't yet approached that level of violence, thankfully. I wonder, from the Colombian example, just the extraordinary impact that ad had. I wonder what lessons there are for the United States, because our media environment is so fragmented. I mean, you think about maybe something like a Super Bowl ad could be like a good way to test that. And probably not Bruce Springsteen in a Jeep Wrangler, but something like that. But at the same time, I think people are just so bombarded by content that it's so hard to break through. And I think the power of Braver Angels has been that we've been able to get people together in person in these sort of deeper, more intimate, more impactful interactions. And we've been able to maintain that to some extent with Zoom. But of course, the question has been, how do you scale that in a way that it could meaningfully influence norms and incentives, which then drive behavior that could hopefully reverse the cycle and make it more virtuous and less vicious. And so,
can I speak to that for a second, Kieran?
Sure, jump in, please.
And then, Amanda, obviously you've done a lot more research on this, but just to that particular point around Zoom. So one of the things, Amanda, that you said really early is that slowing things down, right? And so our most successful in terms of participation numbers online program right now is debates. And we find that they remain very effectively depolarizing, even though they're not in person. And in fact, way more people participate, mostly because geography is not a constraining factor. And the people ask me periodically, why do you use parliamentary procedure? Isn't that antiquated? Can't we just like get rid of the Madam Chair and da-da-da, can I call you just like by your first name? That would feel much more natural to me. And like, can't we just talk directly to each other? And it's funny because the number one function, parliamentary procedure has a couple good things about it for our purposes, but the number one function is to slow things down. It's to and to cue people to the idea that they're in a special space with special rules. This is not a conversation just like any other conversation. They need to like pay a little more attention. And then the other thing we do, right, is as you know, the thing about if addressing questions to Madam Chair is that it's different to hear a question like, how can you possibly believe that when it is Madam Chair? How can the prior speaker believe da 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 da, right? Like it's different. But it's just interesting to me that you mentioned that. And so Kieran, I would submit that that like this can work online. It just requires some systems and some sort of particular tools, which of course can feel artificial, but then they always do. They do in person as well as elsewhere. And so I think that could be part of the answer. But I'm interested in Amanda, your thoughts and observations around that, and B, other ideas for America, because of course the scaling problem remains.
I love that. I don't think I understood that. I mean, I knew how you did the debates, and it seemed to make sense to me, but I don't think I had connected that slows down and kind of shifts hey, you're not on Twitter right now. Like you're not on Facebook.
Exactly.
We do things differently here. And it shows you how much the design of something can change human behavior, right? So I think, Kieran said earlier about incentives. Like we need to incentivize and disincentivize different norms. Like that is absolutely job one, right? How do we create more spaces in which we've designed the space in a million creative ways, like you have with the debates, to tap into our best conflict, our good conflict instincts, right? That absolutely can be done. We are absolutely hardwired, I'm convinced, for good conflict. You see it again and again and again. I talk in the book about the Baha'i faith, which is a really interesting religion I knew nothing about before I worked on the book, but they do a lot of things to try to keep conflict healthy when they're within the faith, including there's no campaigning. Like they have to elect leaders. There's not, a sort of cleric position, and there's no campaigning. You just vote for the people you think in secret ballot, you think most embody the characteristics the group needs at each level, local level and national and international. And you can't even talk about the people. There's no so people don't get split into different groups, right? Which is definitely important. And then once you are elected and you're trying to figure something out and there's disagreement, they have a process called consultation, where in the meeting, once you introduce an idea, it now belongs to the group. Like you can't talk about it as your idea or his idea or her idea. Like there's just these little things they do that they don't always work, right? But they kind of keep the ego in check, keep you from getting too attached to winning. And which ultimately they're actually way more efficient and get more done. It sounds like, oh, that must be just like a slog, but in fact, they get way more done. So that was totally fascinating and hopeful. The same with social media, right? Like if you look at, we all complain about how terrible everybody treats each other many social media sites. But then it's also like, if I need to figure out how to fix my dryer, my clothes dryer, I can get like 47 people giving me like really helpful, polite, generous, patient guidance. When I don't understand, they'll write back. And I mean, strangers, right? Who don't know me. So there's certain sites and contexts that bring out that kind of behavior. And so how do you design more for that? How do you create incentives and disincentives for conflict entrepreneurs in particular? So there are conflict entrepreneurs in our midst, and everyone I followed who shifted from high conflict to good conflict distanced themselves in some way from the conflict entrepreneurs in their world. So for some people, for the politician I followed in California, he stopped relying on the political operative who had been advising him, because she knew a ton about politics, but she saw the world in terms of good and evil, winning and losing. Everything was a war, no matter how inconsequential in her mind. And that's classic, right? I mean, politics, like a lot of journalism, like the legal world, is very adversarial the way we've built it. He started relying instead on his wife for political guidance, and it worked a lot better for him in that case. The former gang leader I followed in Chicago, he literally moved across town. Just that's how he distanced himself from conflict entrepreneurs. For other people, it's firing your lawyer in an ugly divorce, getting a different feed on social media, or turning off cable TV news. But that kind of individual choices are fine. What you'd like to see are more things designed to disincentivize conflict entrepreneurs.
I'm interested. So that's fascinating. And I love your term conflict entrepreneurs. If you could define that for us quickly, that would be helpful. And then I want to ask you about one of the things I noticed early on sorry, I'm trying to choose between questions because there are so many. When you mentioned interpersonal conflicts, right? Like marriage conflicts, I thought about some of the techniques, and Kieran, you mentioned that you've been trying to apply this in your close relationships. And I have learned, my now fiance, Dan, and I get along really well, but also we haven't always. And so we have learned, and because we're like nerds, we read all about the psychology, and like I have 5 or 10 books that are like how to resolve conflict for couples and all of that. And one of the most useful techniques that we learned, which you already referred to, there's paraphrasing and then there's mirroring, which is literally saying back what the person said. And we use this just like, I don't know, almost once a week or something, because it's so helpful to the other person. It's to the point that I've like started trying to do this in my own mind. When I'm mad at him, I'll just pretend he's mirroring me to like try to get myself to calm down. But one of the things that I have noticed and also been taught by different people on this with this technique is that a thing you can think to yourself while you're mirroring the other person, because that's pretty hard sometimes, right? Like sometimes you're like, yes, so you think, or excuse me, you experienced that I said this and it meant X, right? But a thing that you can do to help yourself as you're walking through that is remember that in a certain way, fundamentally what you're doing is holding the space so the other person can process their own emotions. There's a way in which you're just you are actually just a mirror. And that gives them the experience of being heard, the experience of companionship. And I'm curious, A, if you have found that true and applicable in other places. I know I feel like that's true for me. And B, if that's a thing that we could design in to help people feel heard.
I love that, April. The fact that you're doing it in your own head, like imagine that is like some ninja level conflict management. I'm going to try that. I mean, I think
I'm embarrassed to say it actually kind of works. Like,
no, but that's impressive because that's hard to do. So you'll need to understand you're pretending if the other person's not mirroring you, which happens, you're pretending that they do.
Or you're mirroring yourself. Personal. I feel silly, but no, it's sort of like, if I say, do you want to have dinner together? And he says no, I will then go and walk the dog because I don't feel good. I feel rejected. And I will say to myself, I'll picture a voice in me saying, I feel rejected and unwanted. And then I will imagine another voice in me saying, yeah, you feel rejected and unwanted. And it's amazing. It actually helps me feel better. I wanted to have dinner.
Huh.
Oh, it sounds like you wanted to have dinner. Yeah. And that meant something to you. What did it mean? And anyway,
Wow,
you now know
that is so cool. That is, yeah,
more
that
than
is Jedi mind trick
be
level.
telling people this, but yes, go ahead.
No, you should, because everybody has this problem. And the more we talk about it, the less weird it gets. I mean, I think, because you don't need to have a big argument every time your partner doesn't want to go out to dinner. I mean, like, so
exactly.
there needs to be
Right.
hacks.
Yeah, there do. And
So,
I know when I'm the one who's activated and I'm like, can you just calm down? But telling yourself doesn't calm down to calm down doesn't work. So yeah. Anyway.
It reminds me a little bit of, you know, I started doing, as part of this book, I started doing Headspace. Do you ever do this meditation app or one like it?
Totally. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like labeling, I guess, is a big part of mindfulness, is like, and it's sort of what you're doing, I think, is like you have a thought, you know, like let's say I pitch a story idea and the editor rejects it, passes on it, or doesn't even respond, even better.
Totally.
I you know, it's very like, I have to go through a whole sort of like process, and I've gotten better at it over the years, but it's still a process. And you have a feeling like, oh, I'm terrible, I'm the worst, I'm no good at this. And you have to be like, okay, that's a feeling. You feel like you're no good at this. This is it for you. And it's just acknowledging it somehow diffuses it. It's so weird. It like takes the edge off of it.
It is weird,
so
but it's
weird.
So true.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. And I think it's actually a physical, like neurological reality. I don't think it's like squishy as it sounds. So you asked me to define conflict entrepreneurs. Conflict entrepreneurs are the people or the companies or the pundits or the platforms who exploit conflict for profit. Sometimes, other times it's for meaning. Many times it's for attention, power, a sense of relevance. We have designed a lot of institutions to incentivize conflict entrepreneurship, right? There's no disincentive. And we all know people like this. If we're being honest, I think I can say I've been a conflict entrepreneur, particularly as a journalist, very easy to do. And it's someone who sort of delights in every twist and turn of the conflict, right? And usually in high conflict entrepreneurs are the only ones who are benefiting. And it's important to ask yourself, who is benefiting? Ezra Klein writes about this in his book on polarization, to ask yourself, who is winning here? Like, who is benefiting? And it's often the conflict entrepreneurs. And so then it's like, okay, how do we identify who those people are and try to create some space, and also try to shift the incentives so there's not so much of a reward for that kind of thing. I don't know anyone who's gotten out of high conflict without distancing conflict entrepreneurs. So it's hard to do because often those people are very close to you or very much part of your daily habits and routines. But it's an important step if you want to get out of high conflict.
Yeah, I also think that part of the issue with how tribalized the conflict has become is that people are less afraid of the insults and barbs and invective that they're going to get from the other side, and more afraid of the judgment they're going to get from their friends for backing away from conflict. And that's sort of people's greatest fear, that they're going to get called a sellout, or that their identity, which is based on tribal opposition, is going to be somehow shredded. And I think that's very difficult because it makes people feel vulnerable and unsafe and unloved, and also touches on such basic human impulses. So I don't have an answer for that, but that's something I've noticed too, that the judgment of our friends is oftentimes a bigger barrier than just the nastiness we're going to get from our opponents.
That is so true, is we want to belong. I mean, it's like a fundamental human need. It's not a like nice to have. It's a must have. And so anything that sort of puts a wedge between you and your group, whatever it is very uncomfortable, right? I remember talking to a journalist. I sometimes help with sort of training journalists in how to cover conflict without making it worse. And one of this, I talked about how complexity when you're covering controversy can actually revive curiosity, that audiences can handle more complexity than we think in conflict. And this journalist, really nice guy, he said to me, actually Canadian, super nice. And he said to me, my biggest fear is that complexity feels risky. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more. What is your worst fear? Like, what's the risk? And he's like, well, I guess if I'm being honest, it's a tweet storm. I'll be attacked as being, as creating, false equivalencies or being racist or, this is right to your point about his tribe. And I totally get that. And think about how that distorts journalists' coverage, right? Because journalists and extremists and activists are basically most people on Twitter. Like they're the majority of people on Twitter. And I just saw today, Pew came out with a new study of who's on which platforms most often. And I was thinking that Twitter should have a warning on it, like cigarettes do. When you open it up, especially if you're a journalist or work in public conversations, it should say 8 out of 10 Americans do not use this platform. Carry on, but just know that. So when you kick up a tweet storm, it's very painful. It's also not necessarily representative of the country. It's quite unrepresentative. And it distorts and perpetuates and escalates high conflict. So there are ways you could design Twitter that aren't that complicated to make it less so, right? Like the other day I beta tested this overlay that you can, this company's startup is working on, where it just labels the tweets that come into your feed using machine learning and other things. And so it'll say like everything looks normal, but there's a little flag in the corner of the tweet that says something like, may be a bot, or tends to forward misinformation, right? And it's challenging because it's not always going to be right, these flags, right? But it was amazing how differently I felt reading the feed. Like it totally transformed instantly my relationship with the tweets, because it gave me some sense of perspective, like some small way to calibrate these messages, because my brain is not going to be able to do that on its own, right? So if it says, if somebody's attacking me and it says, this could be a bot, it just totally rolls off me. Like I no longer care, right? But I have no way to know that normally. So you could see how you could design platforms for humans, right?
That's fascinating. Sorry, Kieran, if you want to jump in, you can.
Well, I was going to take the conversation in sort of a final direction. So why don't you jump in, April? Sure.
I just want to ask, so I love that. I imagine that's not in your book. I hope you're writing an article about it or something. I just want to know all of these things because I want to apply them and use them. And boy, when you talked about looking for hope, yeah, I hear you. One of the things that you said early on that I wanted to pick up on, actually, that surprised me in an interesting way is you said, I asked you what high conflict feels like, and you said bafflement. That was one of the first words you used, that you just are what the what about the other side? And being somebody who works in political polarization, my immediate thought was yes, blues and Trump voters. It's just how could they think what? And this is also true in red America with regard to blues, but it's not nearly. Blues are the ones who got a big shock a few years ago in the 2016 election, and so it's more just obvious in them right now, I think. And I'm interested in does that come from othering? Is that I'm thinking about our debate process, and based on what we were just talking about mirroring and holding the space for another's emotions, I'm thinking maybe what we do basically is hold the space for people to process through their own stuff and feel heard. But complexity comes into it too, because people inevitably make arguments that are more complex than what the other side expected. And so there's, and another thing that we know is an effect. So, and just to frame this, which I probably should have done at the beginning, the way that I define debates is as a structured conflict. They are intentionally a conflict, and they, that's why people will often say to me, let's get rid of the word debate. Can't we just call them, community conversations or something? And I'm like, no. We are intentionally walking towards the conflict because we have to. That's the only way that we will make progress as a society. So in any case, people always walk out saying, I didn't realize they believed that for that reason or whatever. And I've assumed that that's about othering, and that the bafflement comes from othering. Is that right? Or that was surprising to me because I don't usually think about people in high conflict or in intense. I think of people as saying like, oh, I know what they're going to say. I know what their motives are, not as who are these people? So can you tell me more about that and like how that shows up?
Yeah, well, I think it's a sort of unholy mix of both, right? It's like, what is the deal with these people? And, oh, I know, they're evil. So I think it's both, to be fair, right? But this just absolute like inability to access the other side's thinking, behavior, like there's no part of you that feels like you can make sense of it. A friend of mine said the other day, being an American right now is exhausting. I feel like I spend all my time arguing with somebody in my own head.
Yes.
And then he said, and that person's an idiot. Right. So it's like classic. Because, of course, there's someone on the other side who's doing the same argument and thinks he's an idiot. So yeah, it's this disconnection, I guess. And yeah, I guess that has to do with othering, but it has to do with just not knowing each other. I mean,
I was going to say at a basic level, it's lack of exposure. And it comes from the sorting, I think, that's taken place. I mean, we just increasingly live around the like-minded, and technology has only supercharged that. And so I think sometimes it's literally just like, wow, I haven't talked to a Trump supporter in 18 months. So of course I've come to rely on tribal stereotypes. And I think sometimes we forget that sort of like the first step before empathy or even tolerance sometimes has to just be exposure.
Right. That's a huge change. I mean, if you think about, I don't think we talk enough about the change in the family. I mean, we talk about how we have different media bubbles, we live in different places, but the number of people intermarrying across political lines has declined by 50% since I was a kid. That's a huge change. And so it means that if you're growing up as a kid, you only hear one side of this debate. So the other side really does feel extraordinarily foreign to you. There's no one making the case for any other point of view, typically. So yeah, that distance is really hard to get past.
The last thing I was going to ask about is sort of a epistemological question, because I think it touches a little bit on the fragmentation that we've seen in our media and the lack of cultural and information touchstones. But increasingly, I think people feel like it's not that they don't share values. They perceive that they don't share values, but they also think we don't even live in the same reality. We don't subscribe to the same set of facts. And so I wonder if you encountered that issue in your research, sort of just the very basic role of how can I come out of high conflict if we're simply living in different factual worlds.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, when I talk to journalists in other countries that have covered political violence for a very long time and more of it, they always bring this up. They're like, you know, in America, you don't have a single news source that both sides trust. Like, is that right? That's a big problem. And I think I don't see as much soul searching about that among journalists as I would have expected by now, because we do have totally separate facts, right? And it's a big problem. So we're going to keep living in these parallel universes and making each other crazy until there is a news source that not everyone, but, you know, a plurality of both sides believe is trying to tell the truth most of the time. I mean, it's a huge, huge problem. And it's not true in a lot of other countries that are recovering from civil war and other big problems. Like, it's just not the case. They have rebuilt trust in the media painstakingly, right? But like, it doesn't have to be this way.
Well, that's a conversation for another day, because I think you could open up a whole can of worms with that one. Amanda, this was a fantastic conversation. It was wide ranging, but it touched on so many things that I think people will be interested in. People can find out more by going to your website, amandaripley.com. They can buy the book, which is now out. Is that correct?
I was going to say, like, can I buy it now? Like, how do I buy it right now?
Yep. It came out on Tuesday, April 6th.
Well, congratulations.
Congrats.
Thank you.
And yeah, I encourage everyone to go on Amanda's website, read some of her other writing. And if you're interested in learning more about some of the dynamics we talked about, and particularly, I think the stories you explore in the book are really fascinating, because they bring the issue to life in a way that I think a lot of these conversations don't, which can sort of get trapped in the same sort of intellectual cliches. And so I encourage everyone to check out the book. And if you like this podcast, or if you didn't like this podcast, please let us know. We take compliments, comments, criticisms, suggestions. You can email us at media@braverangels.org. Please like and subscribe, rate us however you want to rate us, but share it with your friends, join the conversation, and please check out Braver Angels at braverangels.org. Thank you to April for joining me, and we will see you next time.